Peggy and Earl Asper, A-S-P-E-R. We lived out where? I can't remember.
They lived out on the corner of Township and I guess it's Holmes.
And the house is still there.
Yeah.
Just a big house. Yep. Yeah. And I don't know.
Her father told me that her grandfather, George W. Asper, built that house in 29.
He was a farmer.
And he was a farmer. He had 90 acres there, and that was a full-time job. And he paid that house off. He went to the bank. The carpenters had finished the house, and he went to the bank, drew his money out, and paid it. And the very next day, that was in October of 1929, the banks all closed. So that little house that's right behind that big house is where she spent her early childhood. Mm-hmm. And that little house is still there and still occupied.
And I don't know what they did to it, but I don't know. It's just a two-roomer.
Is it?
Uh-huh. Because I remember when the stove was going and Dad had always tipped the plate and you could see a reflection on the ceiling. We thought it was Santa Claus all the time. Sure was disappointing. But I know that's that little house is where we lived, in that little tiny house. We didn't think anything of it. I spent most of my young girl, when I was a young girl, in the ditch filling beer bottles. I did. my dad and my uncle Walt, they both had a beer, and Grandpa probably did. But you wouldn't meet any more precious person as my grandfather, George W. Asper. He called us kids little shavers. Every time we'd get in something, well, you little shavers. And, it just kind of rings back.
What's your favorite memory of your grandpa?
Oh, what a favorite memory.
Hauling the cream in and getting a milk nickel?
Maybe, because every time he went in, he had to have these big cans. And
creamer cans.
Creamer cans. And he'd take them over to I lost.
The dairy, yeah.
And he would
sell Challenge Dairy back in those days.
And he would sell his cream, and then he'd bring us out milk nickels. And I remember when by the time he got back out of the place, then our milk nickels were gone, so he would buy us each a new milk nickel, and then he'd take ours that was half gone. He was just a sweet old man. But then there was Vera. That was the third person. That was, she was quite a bit older than us kids. And boy, I tell you, he didn't take her with us. No, so that's fond memories.
So where'd you go to elementary school, Grandma?
Oh, I don't know.
After that, you went to Ammon, didn't you? And your first grade was in Ammon?
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I want to back up. She was born on January the 8th of 1933, and they had to load up a sleigh and load straw in it and a cold stove, and they fired that off, covered her mother up with blankets, and they drove from Township into Idaho Falls. So that's when they stayed in some little green cabins that used to be.
I think they're still there, John.
Right by. No, they're gone now.
Oh, are they?
Right by the underpass. There was some little old green cabins back there, and that's where they left her mother. And then when she had Zelda, they took her to the hospital just down the block a couple of ways. But they had, back then, there wasn't the convenience of automobiles or anything else. It was horse and sleigh
Yep.
to get them in, and they just covered them. They put a coal stove in the wagon, fired it up, covered them all up with blankets, and away they went. And that's how she came to the world.
That's why I'm so rough.
That's how you were born.
Yep. I was I wasn't a bad child, but I just was always doing something. Yeah.
There was only her and her sister Joyce.
I hated her.
I
I really did.
Well,
Anytime I had a chance, I had a high heel shoe in my hand, and I hit her on the head. she was so mean.
Was she an older sister or a younger sister?
Older.
Older. Okay.
She's related to me. The very fond memories she has of out there on her grandfather's farm. When they would irrigate, they flooded the entire ditch, and he had a little horse named Tiny.
Tiny.
And tell them what they used to enjoy running Tiny through the water.
Oh yeah, that was so fun. As soon as they'd get about that much water on all the yard, then my grandmother and grandfather didn't say anything. We would run that horse through that water, and the splashing of the water, and boy, it was entertaining. We didn't have an awful lot of entertaining things. Mm-mm.
So everybody in the family knows that you have a love for animals, and would Tiny be the origin of your love for horses?
Might be just the farm. Yeah.
And observing her grandfather and his dogs. That's an interesting story. He had his dogs trained. Go ahead, sweetheart.
I can't remember their names, John.
Can't you?
Tiny was the horse. Since this stroke, it's really taken a lot of my memory gone. It was, it was so cute. When you wanted to get on her, that horse, you would pat her on the head, right on her mane, and she put her head down. You straddle it, and then she'd toss you back. Yep. Yeah, she was a cute little horse.
But her grandfather had these little, as near as I can picture what they talk about, they were little miniature collies, or the little Scotch collies, and he used to be able to whistle to the dogs, and they'd go down and get the cows. And
no, he'd whisper in their ears.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Move your hands so the voice will go in there.
Whisper in the dog's ears, go get the cows. Man, they'd be right down that 90 and back, bringing back cows. Yeah.
All of those are her fond memories of animals. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Of course, that was a big farm.
Yes.
At the time. And they used to use a slip. They called them slips to bring the hay in. And it was, they'd go down the rows, and they would take the
horses and the slips.
Yeah.
And they'd load the hay onto the slip and take it into the stack yard where they'd stack the hay for winter use.
Yeah.
A lot of difference in the way we used to do the hay and what they do it today.
Yeah. Well, it was easy because you just right on the ground. Yeah. And cuss. My dad could cuss like you wouldn't heard. Never. I never cussed. Even when my kids were little, I never cussed them. I would say, if you're gonna cuss, you go out to the barnyard. And that's where they ended up cussing. Yeah. I can just hear them stomping and yeah, poor boys.
Except when they got to teenagers, and I put an audio system in the house and out into the garage so she wouldn't have to, yell at them for dinner and so forth. And Michael forgot that that was there, and Michael is not a mechanic. And when he gets angry, he is angry.
Yep. And he knows every word there is.
And anyway, she all of a sudden, she said, "Oh," and Dan ran out and says, "Michael, Mom can hear you in the kitchen."
Yeah.
Trying to save his life.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't beat my kids so. Because I remember when Danny wanted to take his motorcycle to school, and I told him he couldn't. I said, "No way, you're not riding that to school." So anyhow, he thought he was going to fool me because I always went for a walk, and it was the 80 acres. So he went for a walk around the 80s, and he figured that when he got back, that I would be in the house taking a nap. I was sitting on his bicycle, and he just stomped and hollered, and but I wouldn't let him take that. It just scared me because there were so many accidents. Yeah.
Dan loved his motorcycle. That gets into our married time here now.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
So would your childhood? Do you think it's similar to um, Mike's and Dan's childhood, or were there a lot of differences? And if so,
Oh
please
yeah.
share.
Yeah, there would be a lot of difference because the four boys, they lived on a farm, and Mike's kids never did. So they just one time Michael was looking for the fox that he saw, and he was running down the ditch, and the what? What did
the
he do?
foxes, the kits, were running behind him, and then he turned around and saw he got 7 foxes that day.
Yeah, but the funny part of it was he was in the ditch,
Yeah,
and the fox was running in front of him, and he was chasing the fox.
yeah,
And
but the kits were behind him.
Oh, behind him.
Yeah,
yeah,
That's funny.
yeah.
we had a good time on that farm.
Yeah.
Best thing we ever did was buy this place, raise our kids, and had calves, and yeah.
Kind of going into that, like with such a farm mentality, was that your first job as a kid working on
Mhm.
your farm?
Mhm.
What was that like? Did you have to wake up early in the morning? What
No,
would be your daily routine?
I don't. I didn't do much working. Didn't have to. Everybody else did the rest of it. We played a lot.
Later on, when you were in your early teens, you picked potatoes.
Oh yeah, yeah. We were up early and picking potatoes, and you'd get a half a sack, 6 cents a half a sack of potatoes, and you'd get out there in the morning.
Did you just pick all day long?
Hmm. And that house is still there that we the people that we picked as you come from town, and don't you don't go to where the cemetery is. There's a road there that you come in, and there's a great big house there, and that is where we
Where
pick
those big
potatoes.
trees are over on uh,
Yeah, I don't remember.
Sunnyside. Down there, just as you get on to Sunnyside and going on up past it, there's a big old house back there, beautiful big old house, and the big trees. They actually had to move the road around to get around it. That it was that farm back there is where she used to go and pick potatoes. Of course, that's long gone under for houses now, but that was a beautiful farm
Oh
back in
no,
there.
it's still there. I look at it every
The
time.
house is there, but not the farm.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So, Grandma, with all the playing and all the working that you did, do you remember any stories of injuries you had in your childhood?
No, I really don't.
You played it safe, huh?
Pretty much until I buried myself in the sand pile. My mother just had a fit. They couldn't find me. I was in the corner of a great big square box, And I wasn't very old, just enough to climb over and get in the sandbox and covered myself up, and they couldn't find me. My mother just went crazy. Here I was in the corner, and I was sound asleep, all covered up with sand. So, yeah, can you imagine that with a child? Yeah, but I was always doing something like that. Yeah.
Did you play any pranks on your sister, kind of like with the sandbox, or it
Oh,
seems
I
like
hit her. I lo- I hit her a lot, especially with a high heel shoe. She used to make me so mad because I was much smaller. Yeah, so.
That's funny.
But she married early, and they had 4 girls, wasn't it 4?
Mhm.
They had 4 girls, and then John and I got married, and we had the 4 boys. Yeah,
That's funny.
yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, so it looks like we're wrapping up.
Oh, as a child, did you ever go on vacation somewhere, or were you always just here in Iowa?
No, my dad took us into Salt Lake around Christmas time.
Oh, why always Christmas time?
With the lights, the pretty, the light, the streets were lit up nice.
The temple, they'd always liked the temple up that.
Mhm.
They've done that for decades.
My dad was not a social person at all. He was tall, and he worked hard, and he didn't want any more kids. No more children. So,
He had a temper. Went in and bought a brand new straw hat. Go ahead.
yeah, he needed a hat, so he went and got a brand new straw hat, and he was trying to work those 2 horses, and they seesaw like this, and they were the great big, what would you call them? Big
Great big workhorses, yeah.
And so, instead of patience, he took that brand new hat off and just beat the heck out of those horses.
Ruined his brand new hat.
Yeah, because they seesawed, and the more he'd hit them, they'd seesaw some more. Yeah, my mother was a trooper. She had I don't know how many sisters, but she had to go down and run the horses home, and she was so small. My mother was very small, and but she'd jump on those horses and bring them back to the farm. Yeah, you did a lot of things you didn't want to do. It was just working, and mother was a worker. Yeah, I don't know. I think Joanna takes after mother. Yeah.
And when you were in about the 2nd grade, your dad bought some land up on Garfield, got a good size with a basement house, and they moved into that.
Dad didn't. He built that very.
The basement house?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, we didn't have that big basement house when we moved out there. He raised foxes, and he would pelt them out. They they would. You tell the story. I'm wearing out of words.
They raised foxes for the pelts, and you couldn't, if you weren't working with them, like you or I would go out there, you'd disturb the mother foxes and they'd kill their babies and eat them. They're very, very temperamental, so you had to be very careful around foxes. I knew we had fox farms down in Malad, but we'll let Mom talk about hers here.
Well, mother, she threw 2 pelts over her shoulder, and that picture above the what?
In the other room.
Yeah, she's got the 2 pelts thrown.
Silver foxes were very valuable back then. Yeah, and they'd have boards that were about so wide and about this high, about 12 inches wide and maybe 3 or 4 feet long, and they would take the pelts, they'd skin the foxes out. And your dad has talked about this a lot. They'd reverse them, slip them down on those boards, and then salt them down to cure them. And that's how they.
Yeah.
We still have some cups that have the fox insignia on them. They're down in Road Haven. Yeah, we took them down there.
Yeah.
But they ran the fox farm for quite a while, didn't they?
Yeah, they did.
So were you part of that, Grandma? Did you have to work a lot with
No.
that stuff? No.
Just with the beer bottles.
Yeah, I had fun. I stood into water about right here, and all day we go beer bottles. But that was all we had. And then you'd go out in the garden before it was planted. It was all plowed, and then you would make a farm. You would get your 2 great big pieces of wood, about like this, and that was your cars. And you would run them through the mud, and then you'd have your roads, and yeah, we just entertained ourselves. It's not like it is now. You go buy something for the kids, and in 10 minutes they're through with it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What was your favorite food? Say it again, because I can't.
Anything. I loved everything except pears. I hated pears. I just, but I can eat them now. But gucks, that was the way I told them I wanted some beets.
They were gawks to her.
Gucks.
Gawks.
You still call them gucks?
No, I don't think I do. I grew up.
And like, how many siblings did you have? Or your parents? Just like basic family. You know?
We'll start out with my parents, my mother and father. They lived in Salt Lake, and they had Garth, Bob, my oldest brother, and then Garth, and then Doris. And my father was running a telegraph school. He was teaching people how to run telegraphy. That was the only way of communication back then. This is back in the 1920s. And then, unfortunately, he ran on real hard times, and so he had to sell that whole business. And he went to Malad and took my mother and my 3 older siblings up there and dropped them off with my grandfather there in Malad in a beautiful big old home that you've all seen. And anyway, then he went to California and was driving a bread truck down there. Work was just, you couldn't find any work any place. So he found work down there, and then unfortunately he got hit by a drunk driver and killed him in Sacramento. Well, I was just 4 years old when that happened. So my very early memories, I only remember seeing my father about 3 or 4 times if I reflect back on it. The one time when he and what the fellow we called Uncle Don, he wasn't a real uncle, but he was very close. And another fellow, and my dad took Garth and Bob to Yellowstone. And I can remember standing there crying like everything and seeing that car leaving with my brothers and my dad. And then the other times I remember seeing him was in his casket. And my grandfather, bless his heart, he was so broken up because that was his only son. And he tried to climb in the coffin with him. So that was a heck of a memory for a kid to remember, you know.
Wow.
So anyway, we lived there in Malad. And back then my mother took in sewing and did almost anything. She did almost anything to just keep us going. We lived with my grandfather, wonderful old gentleman, and I would be there with him alone while my mother was gone working and all the rest of them were in school and so forth. And I can remember taking care of the cold stove, keeping my grandfather warm because he'd lay on a couch right over by the window there. And finally, let's see, he died when I was in the 1st grade, is when he passed away. very, very, very staunch Scotch patriarch. He came from a family of 12 people, 12 brothers and sisters, and they came to Malad from Wanship, Utah, when my mother was just a 7-year-old girl. And it took them, I think she said there was 7 days to go from Wanship to Malad with horse and buggy. And she always remarked before she died, she says, here I took us 7 days to go from Wanship to Malad, and I have seen a man on the moon. She says, that's real progress. And she's right. What a lifetime of experience. But anyway, we had the house there in Malad, and I was not born in a hospital. I was just born in a house. And the house has since been torn down and long gone. Uh, my earliest days are my fondest memories, I guess. We had a creek down behind the house. I don't know if any of you have been down to that old creek. No, I guess not. That's too bad. Michael has, Dan has, Tim has, John has. The creek, and we used to catch little bullfrogs or bullhead fish about so long. We'd go down. I'd spend the whole day up and down that creek, and I was definitely, with my mother working all the time, I was just a street urchin. I really was. My sister and I kind of drug up ourselves in the days, and I remember. I don't know why this comes to mind, but I remember going across a trap door on an old dairy place down there, and I fell in and just sliced my head right open real good. And I came out, and I was running through the street. People were trying to catch me. They finally caught me and took me in, stitched me up, and called my mother. But that was pretty much standard. I was always pulling something like that. And when I was in, I guess the first grade or so, and I was walking home from school. We always walked, and I went behind the store, one of the grocery stores here in Malad, and I could hear this pow, bzz, pow, bzz. Anyway, someone had thrown a box of shells in a fire there. And so I went to run past it, and bam, I got it right there in the leg. A 22 cartridge. And that stayed with me for better than 8 years. They went in and tried to find it at the time, but they couldn't. And it was when I was probably in junior high school at my Uncle Grant, who was a physician down in Pleasant Grove, Utah. He says, let's get, and I had a habit of reaching down and playing with it because it worked its way out right next to the surface. So he went in and cut it out, took it out. I kept it for a long time, but I don't know whatever happened to it now. It's long gone.
I really didn't do anything like that. I've never held a gun.
Yeah.
I just hate them.
We grew up with guns. We always had guns.
Well, yeah.
And
we're not very far from the hills.
No, that's right. And we, my brother and I, Bob was a marvelous brother. He was really, really a great. He was almost a father to me.
How much older?
7 years.
Oh, it makes.
Yeah, he was 7 years older than me. And we used to go down with Frank Clark down to the lambing sheds that he had that were just south of Idaho Falls, and we'd go down there and help Frank out. And then in the spring, we'd always help him with the docking. That's where we used to. You had a big board fence and one opening here with a board going across like this, and you'd have a crew going out there catching the lambs, bringing them in, and you had to castrate the little bucks, make wethers out of them. And the way you would do that, and I was probably a junior in high school maybe a sophomore in high school, before I was one of the receivers. on that action. And what you'd do is you'd have a bunch of knives stuck in this board, and they'd grab the lamb and hold their legs like this, flip their butt up to you, and you'd grab a knife and you'd grab the scrotum and a squeeze, and the testicles would come up, and you pulled them with your teeth because they were too slippery to do anything else. And people that have never been around, they said, "Ah, no, you didn't." Oh, yes, we did. then you'd take the knife and you'd whack off the tail, and then they'd turn them out and let them go and bring another one up. You did that for the whole day. He had hundreds of sheep. Frank Clark is notorious in that he killed, I don't even remember the name. It's beyond. Anyway, he was up Logan Canyon with his sheep, and this grizzly bear came into them and just started slaughtering. Well, Frank went out and he had a 30-30 lever action rifle, and he placed 7 rounds within a 5-inch diameter into that bear to kill him. And he was 17 inches from eye to eye. That's how big he was. And he's notorious down in the Utah State University.
Old Ephraim?
They what?
Is the bear's name Old Ephraim?
That's it. That was him. Yeah. That's right. How did you look that up?
I just looked it up.
Yeah.
So Old Ephraim.
Old Ephraim. Yeah. And he's the one that Frank Clark is the one that killed him. And man, that guy could cook up lamb chops. Oh, I can still remember the lamb chops, and it just in a little sheep wagon. I don't know if have you ever seen any sheep wagons? Oh, they're probably about 6 feet across wide, and maybe 10 or 12 feet deep. And the bunk was back here, and then there was a little stove, and of course you didn't have any running water or anything. And he used to cook up. Oh man, he could cook up good lamb chops. But anyway, that's we got started in when he'd get to leave, or when he had a ewe that would not take care of her lambs, he'd give them to us. So we built up to a herd of we had about 50 sheep there that we'd built up and had in the pasture there behind Grandma's. And then he was getting ready to go up. I would say I was probably a sophomore in high school when he told me one time when I went down, he said they were getting ready to go, and he says, "Johnny, would you like a ewe? She's blind, she can't see, but she's got a nice foal, nice lamb with her." And I said, "Oh, you bet." He says, "You can take care of her because you got a barn and everything up there." So I don't even remember how I got her up there. But anyway, I hauled her home, and I could go down at night and I'd whistle. And those sheep would all just come running right on in and go right in the barn. Just bang like that. And when we got rid of all of them but the blind ewe and the lamb, and I'd go down there and whistle, and the ewe would just start going in a circle, and the lamb would run over to her, lean against her, and then he would guide her on into the barn. Oh, wow. We had a lot of people that would come down. My mother would tell them about this. They'd come down just to watch me get that ewe and lamb in. Well, I came home one night from school, and there was the lamb running back and forth by the creek. And I whistled, and he just kept starting, and he'd run right back and forth. I went down, and there was a ewe, and she had been chewed up something terrible by dogs. We were getting a lot of people with these bird dogs and everything. No dog could step into that whole place after that I didn't nail him. And man, I nailed a lot of expensive dogs. I've had people gonna sue me for, oh, that was a $1,000 dog, and had him all trained and everything. He didn't do anything. He was on our property. He's dead. That was it. I was hell on dogs after that. But that was quite an experience to have that blind ewe and that lamb, and the way that lamb would lead her into the barn at night. And I'd always put them up every night. We had sheep there, and to start it off, Bob, my older brother, I was younger, going back now. But he used to get the lambs, and we had on the. You remember Grandma's house down in Malad? Okay, there was a big porch on the back, just like the porch on the front, but that's gone now. And that back porch, Uncle Bob took a 2 by 12 or a 1 by 12, and then built up on a slant like this, and then bored holes in it, and then we'd take the bottles, slip the nipples over them, shove them down those holes, and the lambs would come up and yeah. In fact, there's a picture in Grandma's book. Have you got Grandma's books? You can see a picture in there of those lambs all there. But that was quite an experience for us. That was Mom likes to watch this Dr. Poe, and some of the things that he's done there, we've had to do. For example, when a ewe could not have the baby, it was too big, a big problem. You had to take and you'd cup a blade in your hand, and you'd go up there and you just literally have to dissect the lamb to save the ewe and bring them out. I know that first time I had to do that, it was hard, real hard to do. But that's what we had to do. Those were good days. We always had a milk cow. Uh, First we had Susie, and then we had Snooksy. They were Guernseys, and
They didn't put out much milk, did
well, a Holstein. They always joked that says you can milk out a Holstein, drop $1 in the bottom of the bucket, and still see the silver dollar because it's so thin. With a Guernsey, you can milk them out, drop it in there, and you can still see the dollar, but it's not that much milk. That's why, because it's very rich, high in butter fat. And Jerseys and Guernseys were the favorite family cows.
Oh, I remember my mother making butter
Yeah,
out of those the cows.
yeah.
Yep.
Take the cream and work it, and I remember the first time I got on a churn. It was down to my aunt's place, and there was a churn about so big around, about so wide, and a big handle out here, and you'd put the cream in there, and then you'd turn this handle, and it'd churn the cream, and then out would come the butter. I grabbed that thing, and I said, "Let me do that, Aunt Lucille," and I grabbed it, and wow, man, I threw cream all over the kitchen.
Yeah.
The exuberance of youth, that's all I can say. That reminds me of, you seen the tumbleweeds, these little Russian thistles that roll. They had a lot of those down in Portage, a lot. That's where my Uncle Elvoyd and Aunt Lucille lived. And I would go down there, and Gordon was a year younger than I, and we'd tie our pants legs up, and we'd go down and they'd pitch those thistles. They were green. They'd cut them just like everything else. They'd cut them, throw them on a wagon, and take them in. And he'd say, "Those are for the horses in the winter." And I'd say, "Oh, they don't want to eat that." And he'd say, "They're better than snowballs." That was Uncle Elvoy's.
He raised a lot of horses.
Yeah. Oh, he had a lot of horses. Yes.
And
He was a
hard to
horseman.
give up. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, and that takes me into I was always, when I was a youth, uh, working in the hay fields. I started off and I'd get 25 cents a day for tromping hay. And that's where you'd get on the wagon and you'd drive the wagon, the horses, and they'd throw the hay up to you. They were in bunches. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the way we used to, and anyway, they'd throw it up there and you'd tromp it and move it around so you can build your wagon up like this. Because otherwise, if you just threw it up there before long, it would start slipping out. And that all worked well until I went down and worked for George Tubby. And he was right down south of Malad, right up next to the foothills. And I didn't realize why he couldn't get help down there. And I went down to help him. And about the third time, a rattlesnake came up on a pitchfork with me. Then I could understand why. And very often we'd get rattlesnakes. They'd like to come up and lay on the hay to get warm. See, back then, to cut the hay, you'll see along the road, people will have old hay mowers. Well, that was with a team of horses, and it was a 4 foot cutter bar. And that 4 foot is as wide as you would be cutting the hay. And you'd go over and up and back and over and back and up. You do that. You can imagine what it took you all day to cut a 10-acre field. Then after that, you'd go in with a rake, and the rake we had was an old hand dump rake, and it had the big tines going down, and you ran with one horse, and it ran along, and you'd hold that thing back, and then when you wanted to dump it, you'd dump like this, and you always did it so that you always lined it up, so that you had the hay all lined up like this. So there would be a 4 foot swath cut here, and a 4 foot swath here, 4 foot swath here, all the way up. Then after that, you'd get on with a pitchfork, and you'd swath the hay. You'd throw one swath over this way and one over this way, so that you had a pile. So every three rows of hay, it was all there. So now, when you wanted to load it up, you drove the wagon down between those rows, and you'd pitch it up onto the. Then you'd go in after you had them all loaded up, and you'd run what they called a Jackson fork. I don't think any of you. I've got a couple of old Jackson fork twines out there, and they're about this long, and they're curved like this. And we had a 4-tine fork. When I got older and worked for other people, we had 6-tine forks. And that means those babies were about like this. Our 4-tiner was about like this. And you'd grab that in the 4 tines, and you'd jam it down in, and see you've got your hay loaded on the wagon. You'd jam it down in, and then the cable that ran up on the derrick down onto the derrick boy down here who was running the derrick horse. And then you had this rope that you kept your Jackson fork rope for tripping it. And what I mean by tripping it, the cable would tighten up when the horse would go, and massive big hay, be about as long as that and about as far as from there to your knees. That much hay would go up with this thing, and then you'd watch it, and you'd take it up, and the derrick would come up, and then you'd swing it over, and the stacker, was the king of the hay crew. And he'd say, okay, over here, a little more, down a little, let her go. And you'd grab if you were running the Jackson fork, you'd pull that trip, and down would go all the hay where they want it. That finger right there, that's what all those scars are. I was running the Jackson fork, and we had a new manila rope there, and it was a little stiff. And I'm always flipping it to, so it doesn't wind up in your feet. And one time I flipped, and it got around just as it pulled all that skin right up, and it was going right over that finger. That's why all those scars are there. My grandmother, bless her heart, we went in, and she shoved all the skin back down, put that old black salve. Mm-hmm. The old black salve. Everybody had black salve. Put that black salve on there, taped it up, back to work we went. Yeah. Yeah. Those were
Fun.
Those were great days. I finally, by the time I was a senior in high school, I was really a certified stacker. So I was run the haystacks, and that's when to get up on the haystack and see they're probably about as high as that building out there. Yes. And to get up there on the top of the stack, you'd grab the tines of the Jackson fork, and they'd just raise you up. And you'd just hang on, and they'd swing you over and then drop you up on top of the stack. OSHA would go absolutely crazy to see how we used to do things. And You always built your stack up real careful, bring it on up, and then you topped it off. You put a nice round top on it, and that's when I was making. Boy, I was really hauling in money, $8 a day. That's that's what we got for being a stacker. And the rest of the pitchers, they'd get $6 a day. Derrick boys, they'd get maybe $2 a day, something like that. Yeah.
It's hard work.
Oh, it was hard work, but it was good work.
Yeah, it
Man,
was.
it was good work. We uh, we always had gallon jugs that we'd carry the water out in. I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but I remember it was a real lesson to me. You had a gallon jug, and we used to wrap burlap around it and then soak it down so it would keep cool. And then we'd take it out, and everybody'd grab a jug and take a swig of water out in the hayfield. And learning the hard way, we didn't have screw tops, it was just a cork that went in there. And I filled up a jug, a gallon jug, all the way to the top, and I put that cork in there, and I went bam like that. Whole bottom went broke out. What I didn't recognize then was that the pressure of that 1 inch cork generated by this much in comparison, and that pressure just knocked the bottom right out of that bottle. So things like that you learn. That's why you don't find any dumb farm boys. They learn what not to do.
They're all
Uh,
smart.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh wow. So how'd you have time for school? Did you go to school?
Oh yes.
Okay. What was school life like?
School was very good. We had, although for me it was terrible because I was just a rebel. That's all there is. I was a rebel. There's no question about it. But we went through 3 different buildings. The first building was grades 1 through 4. And then the next building was grade 5 through 8. And then after that, you went over to the high school. And in Grandma's book, you'll see the old pictures. They were great, big, massive brick buildings with a lot of windows there. All oiled hardwood floors and just many steps to get up and down them. And when we got into high school, then it was the high school was just a pretty modern building at that point in time. They've since done away with it. They got other whole new buildings. At school, we had wonderful teachers. They were all local, most all farmers or farmers' wives that taught, and they were. Everybody knew everybody else, and if you screwed up, it was matter faster than the telegraph. It'd get back to your mother. Bam! Yeah. They were good days, though. They were good schools. Very good schooling.
Wow. So you said you were a rebel, so you played a lot of pranks as a kid, or
There
Yeah.
were some
There's a
pranks.
smile.
Yes, I did.
What would you do?
And well, I'll be very honest with you. When I got into high school, I definitely was a rebel, and I enjoyed breaking whatever rule I could. And our principal was a fellow named Ralph Harding. His son wound up being a congressman, Ralph Harding. And I went to seminary primarily to please my mother more than anything else. And the high school was here, and the seminary building was over here. So he went out of the high school, walked all the way around over and to the seminary building. I said, "This is ridiculous." So it was on the second story, and I just waited for everybody to get out, and then I'd go over and jump out the second story window, and right over to and I got caught, and Ralph Harding took me in there, and along with a couple of other guys that were a little bit of rapscallions, and he said, and Ralph Harding was a good friend of my father, and they used to play basketball and wrestle together, so they were real. And he used to try, and he tried, bless his heart, failed, but he tried to do the best for me. And I dearly remember it. Doris, I was in his office here, and Doris was in a classroom. Doris is my older sister, and she was in a classroom over here. And he took the three of us in there to his desk, and the door was open straight on through, and he said, he chewed the other guys out good, and then he got to me, and he said, he says, it was first, it was this. He says, then it was that. He says, then in my algebra class, you used to jump out the window out of my class and go upstairs. He says, that was my class, and bam, he hit me. I had to hang on to the desk to keep from going down because he was so frustrated that here was his best friend's son that was just a constant screw up. And he couldn't take it anymore. My sister I heard her scream across the hall there. But anyway,
You
we
lived
made it.
through it.
I did enjoy the T&I in school. That was trade and industry, and that's where I got my training in auto mechanics. And I learned how to overhaul engines, learned how to work on body work.
So, oh gosh, the question just left my head. Well, let's go to the other one. Did you have a favorite snack as a kid? What would you love to just eat as a child?
Oh boy.
I need to get back to you. We need to record that.
What, that got?
Yeah, I can't remember.
Yeah, go ahead and ask
Yeah,
Grandma
Grandma,
what her
what-
favorite food
Yeah,
was.
Got.
when I hear that, I think of what is called a gooey duck.
Gooey duck?
Have you ever heard? Do you know what a gooey duck is?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, they're hideous looking.
Oh.
Well, you talk about when I was in the Philippines. I used to watch. We'd have to catch a boat to go from the ship. I was on an aircraft carrier at that time, and we had to catch a ferry that would take us back to the shore and then back. And it was in Manila Bay, and it would we'd pick that up and take it out, and then it'd go on over to another part of the Manila Bay there. And there was this girl. Oh my gosh, she was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I just admire the heck out of her. Anyway, she'd get on that boat to go out there, the little ferry, and the guys were always pushing these little two-wheel carts around with napkins sticking out of them like this, and they say the balook, balooks, balook. You know what a balook is? Okay. Anyway, they were always hauling for the balooks, and then one day I saw this gal, and she bought a balook. Got on the boat, and I watched her, and I admired the heck out of her because she was beautiful. Anyway, and I saw her tap on the gunwale there on the boat, and then she peeled back the napkin. It was an egg. The trouble of it is, it was an egg embryo, and she took the and oh man, man. Even though I'd been raised castrating sheep and doing all kinds of things like that, I couldn't take that. But that's what a bloke is.
I'm just curious, what was your relationship with your siblings? You mentioned about how your older brother being a father figure to you.
Yes.
What about your sisters and stuff?
Oh, my sister and I fought constantly, just like Tim and Joanna fought. We fought all the time, but we wound up being so close, so terribly close. My older brothers, Bob was like a father figure. Garth was being if you study families, you'll find that the second child has definite characteristics. And Garth had that characteristic of being me. I'm macho, and I'll do what I want, And Garth and I had some real problems. Later on, when I read it, I look back great regret that I didn't respect more what Garth tried to teach me. But anyway, Garth and I had problems. Bob and I, we had a wonderful time. In fact, we were we got in a wrestling match at home one time, and Bob grabbed me and I grabbed him, and boom, we went back and hit the couch. Boom, and it broke the arm on the couch here. But after that, he had real back problems, and finally he had to go down and get what they did back in those days. This is back in 1949 and 50. Back in those days, they would just cut them open and take a chunk of bone off of some other part of your body and graft it so it was permanently right along your spine there. Froze up those number of vertebrae. Today they have a lot better ways of doing it. But anyway, he wound up in the hospital, and then it was right during, and so my sister-in-law Zoe, she had twin brothers, and one of those twin brothers came up from Pleasant Grove, Utah, and he and I ran the farm that year. But he was a problem because he had his own ideas of how to do things, and his dad was a damn Democrat. That was a problem right there. And but anyway, we ran the farm that year, he and I, and till Bob got back on his feet enough to take off. But I guess the thing I detested most was he could never get up in the morning to help me milk, and we had about 16 cows, and it was always a job. And we used to take the milk, and we had 10-gallon cans. Here about, well, let's see. You've seen some of them out here. We got 10-gallon cans, and we would take those, and we'd pour the milk in them through a filter. I still got one of those old filter cartridges out here. Anyway, then you'd take those and set them out on the road, and the milkman would come along and grab them and throw them up on the truck. Those guys were always very strong, because those 10 gallons of milk is pretty hefty. You learn to use your knees up on there. Yeah. Life on a farm was not an easy life, not by any means.
But you didn't think about it.
No, everybody did it. That's right. We all just did it. I think of bucking wheat. Back then, you didn't have the combines like you've got now. And you went through with the header, and it was rotating and cutting off the wheat, taking it through, shelling it out, and then running it back through two big tubes that came down like this. And you'd take a burlap sack, and you'd tie it, put it on these hooks, and the wheat would go into there, and then when that one was full, you'd switch it over to go into the other one, and you'd pull that sack off, and you'd put a miller's knot around it, and then kick it off the back, and you'd dump them off in piles of 8. So 8 sacks of wheat, and they were about 120 pounds each. And how he did it, I look back and I say, I don't know how he did it. But we used to take those, throw them, and see the bed of a truck was about like this. And we'd grab them and buck them up, boom. And then the other guy on the truck would stack them up, and we'd haul the wheat out like that. I could no more do anything like that today. I have trouble with 40 pounds of pellets to load in a pellet stove. Yeah. I remember Jack Facer. He was a fellow that Doris, my sister Doris, went with. He was built just like, he had shoulders like this, no hips, and boy, he was just, and muscles, man. He could grab those things and just throw them up like that. And I worked pretty much one whole, probably a month bucking wheat with him. And boy, when I'd get home at night, I was beat. Yeah. That takes me back.
Fun.
Yeah, that takes me back to, I guess I was a sophomore. And no, by golly, it had to have been a junior. between my junior and senior year, I went to work for the Hansons, who had a place out in Pocatello Valley, which is west of Malad. Hot, terribly hot out there. And they had me doing a lot of weeding on a big old rubber tire tractor, and then I had a D4 Caterpillar that I used to run out there to do weeding with. I'd come in at night, and that was my first encounter, the first time I ever ran a combine. By then, this is 1940, 46, 48, something along in there. And we had a Massey Harris combine, and you'd cut and you'd put it in a big bin on the unit itself, and then you'd pull up in the truck and you'd unload the grain into the truck. And they had one big field that was barley, and so the difference in barley and wheat doesn't, unless it's a certain variety, it doesn't have the big beard on it like barley does. Barley has a big beard on it. And that whole field had been hit by frost earlier in the spring. And so it was just real brittle. And I tell you, I'd be driving through there and there'd be a dust cloud all over everything. I had on a pair of coveralls. I'd keep them buttoned right up as tight as I could because it was just, oh, that was the itchiest doggone stuff. You didn't have any umbrella or anything. You were right out in the open. And I always remember farm life was not easy.
I tried it.
That was it. Yeah.
I tried it.
Yeah, you sure did, Mama.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, that takes me up through my junior year.
Let's not go any further.
And I decided I was going to go make some big money. So this friend of mine, Claire Williams was his name, he said, let's go over and find us some job on construction and make some good money. So I said, fine, let's go. So we went over and started off. I'm not sure where we started, but anyway, we wound up in Soda Springs. And there was a big construction crew there, and they were building a drugstore and dry goods store. So we went to work there, and that means we had to rent a motel, buy our own meals, and we didn't make any big money. Roughest crew I have ever been around in my life. I didn't find out until later on that the one guy, all of a sudden there was a big panic, and they said, I can't remember his name, hide so-and-so, hide so-and-so. And here came some detectives and police, and we put this guy in. We had a big chute that we were building, and we put all the cardboard in there and burn it. And so we hid him in there. Turns out he was wanted for murder. That was quite a crew. That was an experience too, I'll tell you.
It was so different in those days.
Oh my goodness sakes, yes. Yeah, that was a growing experience. I've had some good ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's awesome hearing these stories. And do you have any more questions about the childhood?
No, you guys covered everything.
Yeah.
Haven't heard half of mine.
Yeah.
I used to run away every time I got bored. Just run away.
Just go where
Yeah.
you wanted.
Yeah, go to San Francisco and, just, I didn't have any worries. My mother and dad, and my mother would say, I'm going to go get her, and my dad says, let her go. So, yeah,
Wow. Yeah.
it was different.
Yeah, and that's why we want to talk more about this, because not only is this a gap between one generation, but we're the second generation, and it's cool to hear these older stories comparatively to other people. We've been over here for Christmases and stuff, so we've heard a lot of these stories, and we're more immersed in it.
Yeah.
But obviously, as time passes, so do these stories disappear, and we want to make sure that
That's
we
right.
document all of this.
One thing I failed to tell you in my early childhood is I started thinning beets when I was 9 years old. And to thin beets, you had a little hoe with a handle about that long. And my hoe, I don't know where I got it. It was only about, it was about that thick and about that wide. And it was real good because I could go down and whack the beet. The beets were just, have you ever seen beets grow? They're real thick the way they used to be. They've got them down to a science now where they just grow like one at a time. But back then we had to hoe them, and we put them about 12 inches apart, as I remember, maybe 9 inches apart. And then you'd have to pick the doubles, so you only wanted one beet. You didn't want two, so you'd have to. Your left hand was busy picking doubles, and your right hand was busy chopping, and you were on your knees or else bent over, and you'd do that all day long. Your back would be sore, your knees would be sore, but that's what we did. And then the rest of the summer, you had to hoe beets 3 times. You'd had to go out and get the weeds out of them and then check and make sure if there were any doubles, you'd pull those, what we called doubles. We'd pull those out. And you'd do that 3 times during the summer. And then in the fall, now we're jumping up to where I'm a teenager and in high school. And then we would go out and we would top the beets. And it wasn't a lot of mechanical work back then. We would go out and you'd pick out 9 rows of beets, and they'd be yours that you're going to do. And you'd go down the very center, the middle three rows, and you'd pick the beet. I'll show you a beet knife. Like I told you, mine was about 2 inches longer than this because I like to be able to whack a beet and not take the top off without having, because some of those tops would be about that big. So there's what a beet knife is like, and we used to take. And the best thing I used to use was the bib overalls, and take a chunk of that and tie it around here, and then we'd wire it down tight, and then you'd had that because you couldn't lift the beet because you had to have something else to help you, and you'd whack the beet, pull it up, and then you'd always put it underneath you like that, and then whack, and you'd knock the tops off. And on the center 3 rows, you would drop the beet right in the center of the row, and you'd take the tops and put over here. So you'd go all the way down on those 3 rows, and then you would turn around and come back on the next 3, and the one that you had just done is called your pile row. And then you'd top the next 3, and you'd put the beets on top of the ones in the center. So you had 9 rows of beets right down the center. And then they'd bring the truck along, and we didn't have any loaders. We were the loaders. You'd grab the beets and bang them together to knock as much dirt off as you could, then throw it up on the truck. It was work, a lot of work. I remember one fellow had his beets get frozen in for him one year, and several of us went down. He was in our ward, and he's pretty poor. So we went down, and man, it was frosting to the point that sometimes there'd be about that much dirt hung on to the beet, and you'd have to beat it. Anyway, I don't remember that guy ever survived that. He might have got wiped out that year from farming. But that was the way life was, and that's the kind of work we did. I told you last time about all the working in the hay, and how we would pitch the hay on and take it off with a Jackson fork. I should have brought in the one tine I've got of a Jackson fork out here. It's about so long and it's curved. And the big Jackson fork would have 6 tines on it. The smaller ones, the ones we had, were only 4 tine. And I've told you how we used to trip it and put it on the stack. And Grandma, she talks about when she was real young, she'd go and clean houses for people. and sometimes they really did her a good job and gave her a nickel tip. And she'd work all day. And I recall one day, the fellow that lived across the street from us ran a tire recapping shop, like OK Tire. And he asked me if I'd come up and clean his shop for him. So I said, sure. So I went up and he said, I'll pay you. So I went up and I worked all day long. And boy, the dirt, it's just, that is a dirty, dirty place. I worked all day long, and when we were all through, he said, well, he says, you've done a good job, and thank you very much. He gave me 50 cents for the whole day's work. Yeah, things were pretty tight then, of course. In those days, we could take 25 cents, and you go up and you go to a movie, which cost you 9 cents, and then you would get your a little hamburger, which was 10 cents, and then you had enough for some penny candy, and that would shoot the 25 cents, and you can't do that today, not by any means. And Grandma used to, she would be an usher in the theaters here in town. And back then, you went into the theater and you met the usher, and they would take you to your seat. I don't think they do that ever anymore. But she did that, and she would work, and she would usher in the theaters, and then walk home at night from town to 16th Street, where she lived. Excuse me. It wouldn't be safe to do that anymore today. And then she talks about some of her boyfriends that would come down and pick her up and walk her home at night. And they must have been pretty fond of her. I can't blame them. I wound up being pretty fond of her too. And then later on in her life, she would be the cashier at Fred and Kelly's restaurant, and from there she would go down. Well, first she would work in a grocery store all day. Then she would go be the cashier at Fred and Kelly's, and then after that, when they'd close it, then she would go down and work in the outdoor theater, taking tickets and that. So we always worked, kept going all the time. For myself, I would get out of school, and I would go to work in a grocery store, and I'd work there until we closed, and then I would go home and milk the cow, and then go down and work in a little service station that was just right down the street from Grandma's. There used to be a service station down there, and I would go down and work there, and also, try and sell tires and sell batteries. If I could sell a battery, that was, I got a couple of dollars extra pay for doing that. So that takes us up to our teen years, and she continued doing all of that. I continued with about the normal thing, and then in the summertime I was always out working on the farms, and of course back then I didn't ever sit on a tractor until I was a junior in high school. We always had horses, and we'd have to get there early and harness up the horses. And I don't know if you ever been out in the barn out here to see the big horse collars. You see those? Well, that one on the horse right here, and then you'd throw the harness up over the top. I was too small for some of those big horses. I'd have to stand on an apple box and throw it up there, and throw my hip to catch the back part of the harness, and throw them up and put them on, and then the tugs would go from what we call the tugs. That was what the pulling straps. They were leather, about 3 inches by about maybe a good inch, heavy leather, and that's how we used to pull everything. when they would, even in the beats, when they were ready to top the beats, there would be a team of horses, and there were two blades. Oh, they were golly, they must have been about 18 inches, and they'd sink right down into the ground and right along, so that they'd take the beats and plow right alongside them and raise them up. So then we could go along and top them afterwards. Uh, Horses were a part of our life. When we finally got married, Grandma was so excited to be able to have riding horses. I had never known riding. To me, horses meant one thing: work, hard work. And I never got into the riding horses like Mom and Joanna. Oh, as you know how Aunt Joanna is. She's crazy about horses. So that takes us up to, I guess, when I finally graduated from high school. Uh, I went to Logan to go to school for college, but I was too harebrained. I didn't have the good sense God gave green apples, and so I didn't do very well in school at all. So I dropped out in I guess it was about January, the second quarter in college, and joined the Navy. And that was one of the best things I think I ever did, because it kind of knocked some sense into me. You don't go through boot camp without getting some sense knocked into you. That's all there is to it. So, so I went through boot camp down in San Diego, and I had that one quarter of college. I had joined the ROTC, and they wanted me to stay. They said, "Hey, you've got great potential for military, so stay." And I said, "I can't afford it. I'm gone." But the thing I did learn was how to march. And so when I was in boot camp down there, several times the chief, he was our god, really. He managed everything you did, and several times I'd hear him say, "If I had a whole troop like James, I could win every prize," because I always just concentrated, kept my eyes straight forward, and just more. And so they made me what they called a battalion commander at that time, and I would stand up with about 4 companies of troops back this way, and I had a cotton picking sword, and as you know. Anyway, that was good in boot camp. To get to boot camp, Boyd Reed and I were together, and we went down and enlisted, and went down to Salt Lake to Fort Douglas, and that's where we got our indoctrination. And there were 6 or 8 of us there. There were some boys from Buell and some boys from Twin Falls, and then Boyd and I were from Malad. Well, I don't know, for some reason they said, "Okay, we're going to put you on a train and send you down to San Diego, and James, you're going to be in charge." I don't know why, they just picked me to be in charge. So fortunately they said, "Okay, we've got 2 compartments on the train, and then just the plain passengers for the others." So I grabbed the one compartment for Boyd and I and gave the other one to one of the other guys. Away we went. So we went down and went through boot camp down there. And all the way through boot camp, I guess I can't say very much about that other than it was quite an experience. It was a good experience. It kind of knocked some sense into you, is what it really did. And you associated with other people who were from, the majority of our company was from Alabama. And I thought we had fought the Civil War and it was done years and years ago. Well, boy, those guys are still living the Civil War. Oh, man. they save your Confederate money because the South will rise again. That was what they. So after boot camp, we put in for what we would like to do in the Navy, and I put in for aviation. So fortunately, I wound up selecting to go down to. She started off at Memphis, Tennessee, and we caught a troop train. Back then, we're right at the end of World War II, you see, so we're in that era. And that troop train, the open sides for where the chow, they made one big car into the chow hall, and you'd go there, and it was just blowing that grit up. And the eggs. Oh man, I remember those eggs. They were green. Yeah, the scrambled eggs, and you'd go through the line and get that. But I remember that dust blowing in on the sides. So that took us. I don't remember how many days. We got sidetracked someplace in Texas. Boy, I got not very fond memories of Texas. It was hot and dry and miserable, and I ate more railroad dust than I've ever thought I would in my life. So anyway, I went from there to Memphis, Tennessee, and went through what they called Airman Prep School. And from there, you made a selection of what you wanted to do, if you wanted to go into electronics, or if you wanted to go into radioman, or into aircraft mechanics. And I selected the aircraft mechanics because I had enjoyed working with engines. So we went down, and then from there I went down to Jacksonville, Florida. And it was there that we went through pretty rigorous schooling, I'll have to say that. And from there, I'm trying to remember where I went next. I guess it was back to Memphis. Yeah, back to Memphis for what they called AD school. And that was the time that we were being tested constantly. And they grabbed about 4 of us out of the entire class one day and pulled us over and says, "Hey, you guys, you got what we think it would take to go into naval cadets and go down to Pensacola and learn to be a fighter pilot." And I said, "Oh man," I said, "I am so sick of these crash Navy courses. You know, they just cram stuff into you." And I said, "No, I'm not going to do it. Big mistake. I should have done it, but I didn't." So from there, I graduated from what they call this A school, and was lucky enough to select where I would go. And I put down, just out of a lark more than anything else, Hawaii. Well, I wound up getting Hawaii. So I wound up, this friend and I, we were very close. We wound up going to Hawaii together. And we wound up in an air sea rescue squadron there. And we had the old PBYs. They were big, over the wing all the way over the top, and then there's a fuselage that came down and connected onto the fuselage. I wish I had pictures of them to show you, but I wound up being lucky enough to go into the flight engineering. So as a flight engineer, I wound up being in that little section up there where between the wing and the fuselage is where all of your controls were for the mixture control, for operating the cowl flaps, operating the oil coolers, everything. You had an entire panel there. And when the pilots they had the stick and they had the throttles. But mixture control and everything for setting the gas mixture, that was all up to us. And very tight little spot. You're in a spot that isn't just about like this, just enough to fit into. And you had your seat belt and straps, and you'd pull it over, and you'd always lock yourself in. Uh, had some wonderful experiences with that. We made sea landings, and that's an experience when you set down a big plane like that into the water, and it's just a roar when that fuselage hits that water. Whew, you know. Well, this one time we always had to have the APU, auxiliary power unit, cranked up and going before you made a sea landing, so that if by some chance you'd lose an engine, you had to have that APU to run the starter on the engine again. They had two engines, big nacelles, and this one time I was I had just come down off a shift, and the next guy went up, and he was sitting there, and they were going to make some open sea landings. So I went back to start the APU, and it was a son of a gun to get started. And I pulled on it, and I pulled on it. Well, there was the after station where there were two 50 caliber gun mounts, and then there was a bunk section there with the APU, and then the next little section was where the radioman was, and then the next one was right up where the pilots were, and up above the bunk compartment is where we'd go. We had to climb up there and do our things up there. This time I was trying to start the APU, and we had a new pilot. They were just training him on how to make open sea landings, water landings. And unfortunately, see, the one thing we had to do that we had control of as flight engineers, right up on the wingtips, there were great. It was the floats were about as long as from me from here to Aaron there, and they're about this wide and about this deep, and they were just big floats, so that when you landed that baby, because the wings seemed like 90 feet, and you'd lower those down, and they'd go down, and when you'd hit, then if you tipped off, then you'd have those to stabilize you. Well, this guy, he was new, and I was just trying to start the APU, and we sat down and hit the water, and he cranked it over, and the starboard float dug in, and it jerked us, and I was just pulling, and wham, I flew all the way up and past the bunks and folded backwards over the navigator table. Hurt like heck. They x-rayed me, and they said there's not a thing we can do about it, but you'll just have to live with it. You damaged some vertebrae, but back then there wasn't much they could do. You bit your tongue and went about your business. So anyway, and then that was one very memorable experience on that old PBY. We would go out, and when they were trying to get a bunch of B-26s, a little double-engine plane, a little attack bomber. They were trying to get them over to Korea, and so sometimes, the pilots, if they didn't watch their mixture control, they'd use a lot of fuel. You had to lean it right on down. You'd have to just watch, and you'd lean it down to the point you'd see your cylinder head temperature just start to rise up, and you'd say, okay, we got it too lean, so you'd mix it up for a little hotter gas. And some of them would not watch their mixture control in flying out, and so they would leave, say, San Diego or San Francisco, and they'd not get quite to Hawaii, and they'd have to ditch. And so we would go out and try and find them, and boy, I tell you, you never want to be lost out in that ocean, because it's really a big ocean, and you're not much down there. We'd fly at 400 feet and try and find these guys. Sometimes we found them, sometimes we didn't. But then we'd have to make open sea landings to go down and pick them up. I remember another time we got called from the island of Kauai. That's where these people have gone to now, to Kauai. And a fisherman was on one of the fishermen on a boat there. They were tuna fishers, and they always had themselves strapped in, and they had these big poles, and they'd go out and they'd hook those tuna, and boy, those tuna were big. And well, one time this guy didn't have his belt strapped tight, and he pulled just as the tuna pulled and pulled him into the water. Well, a shark got him and whacked. He was right about here that the shark got him, just tore him good. So they had to get him to Honolulu to get to the main hospital there. So we had to fly over and get him. I always remember that experience. Blood on back. It was a bloody mess. But anyway, I stayed there for 2 years at what was called Barber's Point. That was their Naval Air Station. Uh, we had two PBYs, and we had what was called an R4D. Uh, that was a super DC-3 is what it was. We call it the R4D, and we had a little Beechcraft, and we had an SNJ, a little trainer plane there. And this bomber squadron was just getting ready to take off and head for Korea. Excuse me. And our runways were like so, and the prevailing wind was always from the west. And so they took off. He was fully loaded. He was wrapped up all the way, and he just took off on this runway because the wind was coming in like this. And he took off and just got cleared, and bam, his engine caught on fire. So he couldn't make it all the way around to come back all the way around. So he just turned and came back in on here. Well, as soon as he hit the deck here, that engine dropped down, and the prop was digging in, and that pulled him over, and he caught our one PBY with his right wing. That swung him around, so he got our other PBY with his left wing, and then he got our R4D. He just wiped our whole squadron out, and I'll always remember that engine. We hauled it over and put it on what we call the wash pad, big concrete pad. Couldn't put it out. Well, that's because the engine was made from magnesium. I showed you what magnesium does. The little strips. You can't put it out with water, and we soaked it, and no good. We just had to let it sit there and burn out. That's all we could do. The only other thing we could have done was just take dirt, and that would have not worked. So that took care of our squadron. So we needed to have another plane. We had to have. Well, they were few and far between, the old PBYs that we had. They found one in Opama, Japan. So that's when they picked myself and another first-class petty officer for flight engineers, and the top radioman we had, and top ordnance man we had, and they flew us. We flew to Japan and picked up this PBY there in Opama, which is just down from Yokosuka. You're probably well aware of all of that, yeah. Yeah, it was so we got that plane there, and I always remember we'd go down and we'd check it over, and then we'd take it on a flight to check it and make sure it was okay, and one thing after another. We were there for, oh gosh, it must have been close to a week. We were there checking that plane out and making it ready. And I can remember watching this one fellow one day, a Japanese fellow, and he came and he undid this beautiful looking donut. Man, that was a beautiful looking donut. And I thought, wow, and I said, where do you get that? And he finally understood. He said, oh, and he reached in, he handed me one. And I thought, oh, no, I don't. Oh, no. I've been into it. I dang gone near gagged. It was fish. What is it, Aaron? It's a strong, terribly strong fish ground up and made into a donut shape. Oh, that was that was the second worst foreign thing that I ever tried to eat. The worst one I'll tell you about in the Philippines. But anyway, we got that. We got the PBY. We finally checked it all out. We took off, and the weather wasn't that good. So our first stop was going to be Iwo Jima. You've all heard of Iwo Jima. Well, we we were about halfway there in the foul weather, and the antenna we had ran from the top of the wing back to the vertical empennage, the big tail section. Well, I could see that thing when I'd go into the after station and see it, and boy, it was just starting to grow in the frost building on it, and then finally it broke. So we lost radio contact. We only had short communication, so we finally made contact with the Air Force there on Iwo Jima, and they came out, and boy, it was lucky they ever found us, and they guided us on into Iwo Jima, and I'll have to tell you the story that Scriber, he was the first class petty officer, and he was the other flight engineer, and I had just spent my couple of hours up there. You can only stand that so long running things. And so I came down. And it was cold. Holy mackerel, it was cold. We had a big fleece-lined flight suits, and underneath that we had our regular coveralls, and then we had the big fleece-lined jackets because it was just horribly cold. Probably the equivalent of 60 to 80 below zero up there at that time. Well, I had just come down, and then the radioman made a motion to me because you couldn't hear anything, and he pointed up, and so I walked over and I looked up at Skyver, and he says, "I gotta go." So down he came. I went back up there, and he went down, and we had our toilet on the plane was a aluminum can about that big around, and then an aluminum seat that you plop down over it, and you put a bag down in there, and then you'd do your thing, and then you'd open the hatch and out it'd go. Well, I waited and I waited, and I was up there for a good hour, and Scriber didn't come back, and man, I was getting kind of blurry, and so I banged and got the radio, and I said, "Where's Scriber?" And he said, "Oh my gosh!" And I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "You better come down and look at this." So I got down, and Scriber was back leaning over the bunk like this. His flight suit was all dropped down here, and you seen these baboons with a red bloody butt? That was Scriber. I mean, what he had done, he'd gone back there, not realizing how horribly cold it was, dropped that aluminum seat down, dropped his flight suit and the heavy wool flight suit, and he was sweaty, of course, and he sat down on that aluminum seat, and it just pow, and he stood up, pulled all the skin off his butt, clear up onto his scrotum. It was a sight, I'll tell you. So for the rest of the flight, I was up there, and Scriber was in no shape to do anything. And here we are, lost our antennas. So we finally the Air Force came out with, I don't even remember the name of that plane. They found us, thank goodness, and they guided us on into Iwo Jima. And we landed there. That was quite a trip. We landed there, and they put us up, and we checked all our engines over and got the Air Force guys to help us with all of the radio contact because we had stripped all of our antennas. And they were very friendly to us, and they told us, "Oh, you've got to go down to the underground hospital." Well, you've seen pictures of the invasion of Iwo Jima. It was horrible. I mean, we lost more guys there. Well, Mount Suribachi is on one end, and then it's a plain for, I think it's 5 miles, and they had dug down. They had tunnels every place in there. Well, they were just so anxious to get us to go down here into this underground hospital. When they were cleaning the place up, one of the big D8 caterpillars, dropped a cleat down. The entrance to the hospital had been sealed off with all the bombing and everything. So, so we went. They finally said, "Oh, come on!" And so they gave us flashlights, and they went over, and we had to climb down through a bunch of rubble, and that was the first deck. And the navigator we had, his name was Markley, and he says, "I want to get a good skull and for a mantelpiece." I says, "You got to be crazy!" He wanted to get a skull, and they told us, "Oh, there's skeletons are just all over down there." And what they would do is they'd dig a passage just about that wide and too low for us to go without bumping our heads. Just bumping your head constantly. And then they would niche back in here it was a volcanic soil, of course, just enough room to lay a patient down there, and then niched into the side there would be niched back in, and that's where they have their weapons and their grenades and their ammunition while they were being treated. Well, we got down to the second floor, and fine, and we'd see all kinds, the bodies, skeletons all over there. And we got down to the third floor, and boy, it was getting stuffy, hard to breathe. We just had these flashlights, and that you can imagine what it's like, that volcanic ash. You put a flashlight on there, and it's just that much, no reflection in any place. And so we're going down through there, and just kind of amazed with the ammunition and the guns and everything that were still sitting there from the end of World War II when they invaded Iwo Jima. And Markley says, "Good hell, look at this." And the normal digging back in was about 6 feet, I would say. And this one they had to dig out more, and it was, even at that, it was the skeleton was sticking out into the aisleway. He must have been one of the Imperial Japanese Marines. And Markley reached down and took this femur, the femur bone, and he said, "Look," and it was about that long, monstrous big guy. But in so doing, I still have problems with it. In so doing, when he reached down to grab that femur, he got it, and then he put his flashlight up. None of us really realized until he put that flashlight up and showed it on the ceiling, and it was just about every foot be a spider about that big.
Oh my!
I never in my life felt so appreciative of the Hindu belief in nirvana, where you go into nothingness, just absolute nothingness. And that's what I wanted to do at that point in my life. I tell you, I hated spiders. I have always hated spiders. And to see those down there and realize we'd been banging our head on the ceiling all the way down there, that was we couldn't get out there fast enough. We cussed, though. We got up there, and the Air Force guys just laughed. They thought that was so funny that they got us Navy airmen, and they really pulled a goodie on us, and they did. They pulled a real goodie on us. So we finally got everything wrapped up and took off and headed for Wake. Well, this was quite a trip, I'll tell you. So we headed for a wake, and we got clearance to land, and we'd called the flight plan and everything else, and we landed, and as soon as we hit the deck, here came these jeeps up, all of them with 50 caliber mounts on them, and boy, they were down for business, I'll tell you. And it turns out that just a few months before, they had had an exercise where they took a bunch of Marines, landed, no flight plan, landed, bailed out of the plane, and went over with cherry bombs, and they'd say, "Pow! That building is gone." Shoot a guy with dye, you're dead. You're dead. They took over the whole island, and it was an exercise to show them how vulnerable they could be. Well, little did we know that had gone on, and when we landed with some confusion in our flight plan, they figured, here we go again. So they grabbed all of us, locked us up, put us in the brig, and we couldn't convince them. So they they got us in the brig, and we got the bright idea, we'll try and break out of here, just the heck of it, you know. That was a mistake. Anyway, then they really locked us up. And Markley, that same navigator, they were asking us, name, rank, service, the whole darn works. And Markley, he was always wanting to get us in trouble. And they said, okay, well, where were you born? He says, born? He wasn't born. I was crapped on a rock and the sun hatched me. That was Markley. So anyway, after we'd gone through this, it was a full night of interrogation. They found out, yeah, we were for real. We were just trying to get a PBY back to Hawaii. So that was the end of that real problem. And then from there, from Wake, we flew to Midway, fueled up in Midway, and then all the way down to Oahu, to Barbers Point again. But that was a trip I will never forget. It was very, very different. So that took care of that phase of my life in the Navy. After I had finished up there, one of my most memorable experiences, which all of you are very well aware of, was we got a call that a very special person needed transport from the Marine base at Kaneohe go down to the big island of Hawaii and go to the Kona coast. So we, not knowing anything more than that, up we went with our R4D. And I was a plane captain on that one. That's why I wound up going. And we landed, and lo and behold, who do we pick up but Harry S. Truman? And so, holy Moses. So we picked him up and went down. If I remember, I fed him on the plane too. We had a little tiny stove there, and I was able to cook steaks. So we took off from Kaneohe and headed down to Hawaii. And in the process, I chatted with him because he was just he and I in the whole plane back there. And in 15 minutes, he put you at ease so much you'd thought he was Uncle Harry that you'd lived right next to all your life. He just had that magnetic personality that was just, it was marvelous. It was quite an experience. Made me really appreciate. I've never been a fond person of the Democratic Party, but boy, that's one guy, and I will admire him to the day I die for doing what he did when he dropped the A-bomb. Because unless you've been there, and I think probably the same thing down in Taiwan, they had tunneled. The Japanese were great on defense. If we had not diverting here, Had we not dropped the A-bomb and had to go in and fight like we did on Okinawa to go into the main Honshu, we would have lost millions, literally millions of troops, because they were so dug in, so totally dug in and ready to fight. And they said they would fight with bamboo sticks to the very death, because they their emperor was their imperial god. And if you ever get a chance, read the book by Bill O'Reilly, Killing the Rising Sun. And in there it points out a little bit of the Japanese mentality, the horrific, I mean horrific atrocities that they pulled. I had a stepbrother, Keith Budge, who was taken captive by the Japanese on the island of Bataan and Corregidor in the Philippines. And he went through the entire war in one prison camp after another. Came home as a 90-pound skeleton, his heels eaten off from jungle rot. Never talk about it, but the treatment that they gave the American soldiers is just horrible. And needless to say, what they did with the Christian, particularly the Catholic nuns that they took there in the Philippines, just terrible, just terrible. Anyway, so where did we leave off here? We took Harry Truman down to Hawaii, and then I guess about a week later, we got a call, go pick him up. So same crew, we went over and flew down there and picked him up and brought him back. And it was at that, as I remember the return flight, where he'd even remembered my name. James is all he knew me by. We picked him up and flew back, and it was at that point in time, being the youth that I was, and didn't have enough common sense to not do it, I asked him to sign a dollar bill for me, and also to make a notation in my flight log. And that is the flight log that your folks all have, the picture of me sitting with Harry Truman, and then the flight log where he says, thanks to Lieutenant John A. James on such and such grand ride, such and such a date. Very, very much of a keepsake to me. So that we brought him back. The co-pilot, when he saw what he had written in my log and signed, he was so he was totally exasperated, because he wanted so much to have something to remember that Flying Harry Truman, and I'm the only one that had anything to show that we had done it. Oh well. So that's the end of that story. Okay.
So, Grandpa, what year did you join the Navy?
1951. Yeah. Yeah, and then the Korean War ended in 53. And I got out in 55. Yeah, when I got out of the Navy, I at that point in time, you could draw what they called 5250. You could draw $52.50 a month for 50 weeks because you were being discharged. I've never been one, never to take gratuities. No. I could have built grain bins out here like those that Earl had over here. But being this staunch idiot that I have been all my life, I wouldn't accept a giveaway program from the government. I figured you make it on your own. That comes from, I don't know if I told you this or not before, when I was just a wee lad, probably the fourth grade, but maybe third or fourth grade. They were a very progressive bunch there in Malad, and these ladies set up a school lunch program, hot lunch. and it was 15 cents to get that hot lunch. And Doris and I were both in the same building in school at that time, and like I say, I don't think I must have been maybe, oh gosh, third, fourth grade, something like that. And the principal, Mr. Fallis, came to me and he says, uh, where your mother is a widow and supporting all of you without any other help, you qualify for getting free hot lunches. And I thought, oh, hot dog, this is great. And he says, if you, both you and your sister. And I said, oh, great. Well, I went home and I told Mother. I says, Mr. Fallis told us that we could get our hot lunches free. That dear little old Scotch lady probably ragged on me for 3 days to get it across to me, we don't accept welfare in any way, shape, or form. We stand on our own. And that's what's setting my psychic over all life. And it's that conservative nature that has disappeared in this country. It has really disappeared. You all can be very thankful that you've got the parents that you have that have taught you your independence. It's so cotton picking important. When you're in school, when you're striving to get someplace and help this country, I can see going and getting help. That's fine. That's okay, because the country will reap the benefits from that, just like I reap the benefits of my service time by getting my college partially paid for. So, but beyond that, these welfare programs today, I'm not very much for them. So anyway, where were we? Oh, anyway, I flashed back to say why I have been probably the cantankerous person that I have been on those programs. So I got out of the Navy and came home here, and I couldn't find any real good work. And when you get out of the service, you don't think too much of civilians. We're a bunch of disorganized, backstabbing fools. Where in the service, you die for your buddies. It's just a totally different attitude. So anyway, I wound up coming up here to Idaho Falls, and I got a job with Triangle Lumber. They occupy the building now that the heating outfit does down on South Yellowstone Highway. And that was a lumber yard there. And I went to work there, and one of the things I remember about that was a bunch of old buildings. And they said, hey, you guys have got to go clean up this lye that's been spilled all over. The bags are all broken. We went, and a fellow by the name of Lloyd Poulter and I, and we went in there and cleaned that up. But boy, oh boy, we suffered from it. It broke out in blisters and everything from scooping up that lye. And that takes me back, oh boy, takes me back to my high school days when I went to work for a fellow by the name of Bowen. And he had a wheat treating outfit. It was a rather small outfit. You'd dump the wheat in one place, big bags, 120-pound bags, and then you'd put this sear sand, which is a red poison that it'd go in and it'd treat the wheat, cover the wheat, so that the bugs couldn't eat it. Well, we got out there, we'd been treating for several days, and we went out there one day, and something had happened to our can. We didn't know where it was or anything else. We said, well, we've just got to get this job done. So unfortunately, we dipped up that sear sand with our hands and dropped it in there. Well, we didn't realize what a horrible thing that was. Anyway, that night, fellow by the name of Claire Williams and I. We were running the treating unit, and I think we had a Model A Ford, and this is in Pocatello Valley, out west of Malad. That night, we both, boy, I'd drive and he'd hold his hands out the window. And then he'd drive and I'd hold my hands out the window. Burn, oh, just terrible. Well, the next morning I woke up and I was just a one big water blister from right here all the way down. My fingers, I couldn't get them any closer than that. It was just totally one big water blister. Went into the doctor and he says, boy, he says, I'm not going to last that. He says, you'll lose too much body fluid. You've got 2 pints of body fluid there. We'd poisoned ourselves something terrible. So he just wrapped me all up in gauze. But he says, let your body reabsorb that. That's something I forgot to tell you. This was one of my high school. That's when I was in high school, yeah. And we drive that old Model A. See, it's about 30 miles out to Pocatello Valley. Another flashback. Okay, so I came here, got a job at Triangle Lumber, driving truck. And that one experience of cleaning up that lye reminded me back on when I had really fouled up with the sear sand. I came here, got a job after the service, of course, and I got a job with Boise Cascade Lumber, driving truck for them. And one of the fellows that was there was truck driver along with me, was a fellow by the name of Ray Clifford. And that was the husband of Joyce Clifford, Grandma's sister. So he was always on me. You got to go on a blind date with this sister-in-law I've got. I said, no, I don't want any blind dates. But he insisted and kept at it. So one day we hauled a bunch of lumber out to a house on 6th Street, which was just down the road from where Ray's house was. Well, he picked me up early. We'd gone home for lunch. And he picked me up early, and I'd gone to my sister Doris's place for lunch. And he picked me up early, and we drove over to this place and started unloading the lumber. And then I noticed this beautiful big Pontiac Chieftain car that pulled up to his place. And I watched and I saw Zelda get out of the car and go in to see her sister. And I says, okay, I know what's going on here. She's spying to see just what I'm like to go on a blind date. So I went out of my way to never walk out so she could see me. She never forgave me for that. So anyway, wrapping it up, we finally went on a blind date together and went swimming up in Heisey. And that was our night out. And we went out many, many times with Joyce and Ray, and we'd always go dancing. And back then, there was 3 or 4 places you could dance here, and then Rigby had some places you could dance. They don't have those anymore, I don't think. I don't think any of them. So, I chased her till she finally caught me. That's the best way to put it. I went down to, I'd quit the lumber company and gone to work for Buckendorf Motors. They needed a mechanic to service out all of the new Lincoln Mercurys that they were getting in. And they'd had real trouble keeping up with the flow. So I went on, hired on with them, and I took care of all of the new vehicles. And sometimes they'd come in out of the factory. You can't believe the attention they needed. So we had the Lincoln Mercurys, and I serviced all them. And then I noticed these guys come in from the site, uh, and I'd talk to them, and they didn't impress me very much. Uh, and I said, maybe I ought to look into something like that. So I applied with the Veterans Administration to go down and take some tests to see where I would best fit. So I went down to Salt Lake, the VA, and I took a whole battery of tests. Took all day, from early in the morning till late in the evening. And when we finished up, the guy looked over all of my scores, or he says, "Military officer, you fit right in all the way there, very well." Or how about dentistry? And I said, dentistry, no. I don't understand looking at somebody's stinking mouth all day. No. And he said, "Well, what would you like to do?" And my brother was so impressed with with his buddy, Dean Kelly, who was an engineer. And he thought, boy, I guess Garth had tried some engineering courses and says, "Woo, that's not for me." And so he had been encouraging me to go look into engineering. Grandma encouraged me to engineering. And I said, "I don't know, I thought about engineering." And the guy looked at my scores, and particularly my horrible, horrible high school record. I mean, it was bad, as I've told you. And he says, "Well," he says, "I won't say that you can make engineering. And I won't say that you can't make engineering." I'll never forget those words. He says, "But if you do, it's going to be the hardest work you ever did in your life." And that cotton picker was right. Man, I went in there, and I had to start right off with the bonehead math, because my math in high school was terrible. Uh, anyway, so I wound up going and signing up at Utah State again. She had started there way back, and I signed up again for going into. They didn't have aeronautical engineering, which I wanted very badly. I loved the planes. And they said, "We've got aeronautical technology, which is just one step down, and fantastic jobs and good career opportunity." And I said, "Okay, let's go with that." So I signed up into aeronautical technology and went for about 2.5 years and doubled up on all of my courses. I don't know why I always put myself through it like that, but I doubled up on all the courses. And then they finally were getting, I could see they were not going to get aeronautical engineering, but they did get mechanical engineering. They had tool engineering, they had electrical engineering, they had civil engineering, but they had never, they finally started a curriculum for mechanical engineering. I said, boom, that's what I'm going to go for. So I again doubled up on my courses. I lacked 12 quarter hours of having a bachelor's degree in aeronautical technology, but I just dropped that and went full hog into mechanical engineering. Uh, Finished that up, and out of a lark on my senior year, I I interviewed several. Had some, well, in the meantime, between my junior and senior years, I had put in out here at the site, and I was hired by General Electric in the engineering unit there. It's called equipment engineering, and they gave me some real good challenges, and I did very well at it. Got basically a couple of patent applications, which really looks good on your resume. So I went on through, and I can still remember that. Oh, uh, so out of a lark in my senior year, Well, I had 1 year over my senior year because of all of my background. And I had taken modern physics, which was a tough, tough, tough course. And and they had one course on nuclear engineering starting there, so I took that and did very well in it. Uh, and so I went one day, just like I say, out of a lark. The Atomic Energy Commission was interviewing that day. So I said, "Oh, what the heck? I knew I could get back on a General Electric because they wanted me back with my experience on what I'd done." And I went, like I say, on lark to this Atomic Energy Commission interview. Well, I sat down there and interviewed them, and they said, "Boy, if you get selected, we're looking now throughout the country, and we're going to select." We lack nuclear engineers badly, so we're going to hire 30 engineers throughout the country to go into advanced engineering programs where you would come out someplace between a master's and a doctorate degree. And they said it's going to be very selective, and we're going to hire 15 and we'll send them to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, or the other 15 will go to the International Institute of Nuclear Science and Engineering, just outside of Chicago, Illinois. Well, lo and behold, I got an approval. So here I am, General Electric, Boeing, Hercules. I had a whole batch of real good opportunities. Or this chance with the Atomic Energy Commission, where they would give me this advanced training and pay me all the time I'm getting it. It wasn't much. $58.80 a year is what my opening salary was. So I really wrestled back and forth, and I really pondered, what should I do? So I decided, hey, I'm going to go with the Atomic Energy Commission because they were a very selective group at that point in time. You had to have 7 years of experience to even get on with them. So this was a real chance to. So I went back. We lived in Downers Grove, Illinois. And John was just 5 years old or so, not less than that. And Dan was just a baby in essence. And yeah, because Dan was born when I was working with General Electric in 1959. So I went through that program, and as a result, they said, okay, now you are committed to sign on. There were 7 atomic energy labs in the country. There was this one, there was San Francisco, there was New York, there was Oak Ridge, there was, anyway, all 7 of them. You will have to go on 6 month stints to each of the labs and really learn what the Atomic Energy Commission is about. Okay, I've been that. Or else, if you don't want to do that, you can pay us all money we've got invested in you in the International Institute. Wow, that was a horrific figure. No way could I do that. So they said, where would you like to start off? You can go to Oak Ridge, you can go here, or whatever. I said, put me down for Idaho. I'd already been here, and it was my home. So I wound up coming to Idaho for a 6 month period. And after that, I would be cycled through the other labs. Well, 30 years later, I retired right here. And that takes us up to 1986, 1st of 87. And I retired from there, but the manager here, when he signed my retirement, he says, I don't want you leaving. I want to keep my thumb on you. And he meant that. He wanted to keep it. So from there, I went to consulting. I consulted with Rockwell and with Raytheon, all of the people who are trying to get on here at the site. And Uh, ah, so I consulted for, I guess, about 10 years. And I'll be very honest with you. That's where I was able to make some money. Yeah. I was able to go right on at $125 an hour, which is a very healthy sum, and it helped. Okay, so that takes us up to when I retired in '86. I consulted for the next quite a while, and in those closing years, I I wound up well. Before that, it was in 1980 that I'm sitting in a staff meeting, and the manager's secretary came walking in, just walked right into our meeting. She said, "John, Charlie Williams wants to see you now." And I said, "Well, let me finish it." "No, now." So I got the message. He wanted me now. So I went in, and this was, like I say, this was in 19, I guess 79 or 80, along in there. And I went down to his office, and Charlie Williams was a very brusque, really a mean person. He was mean, no question about it. And I walked in and said, "Charlie, you wanted to see me?" And he said, "Yeah." He says, "I want to thank you for volunteering for taking over the FAST project." It was a notorious project that was in $200 million job that was in deep trouble. And I said, "Whoa." I says, "Hey, I've never been to the chem plant. I'm a test reactors man." And he says, "Thanks for volunteering." I said, "I guess I got my marching orders, Charlie." And he said, "Yeah, you sure have." And he said, I expected that I was going to walk into a bucket of worms, and I wound up walking into a barrel of rattlesnakes, is what it was. And so we had three different contractors there. There was Catalytic and Parsons and Enico. Parsons was the designer, Catalytic was the constructor, and Enico was the operator. The operating. they're now what your company is today. Back then, that was Enico. So I went out there and worked with Dick Schwartz, who everyone just feared something terrible because he was just he's a hard-nosed. He lost one eye in Korea, and pretty tough individual. And Charlie Williams said, "Now, do you think you can work with Dick Schwartz?" And I said, "Yeah." I says, he's just a hard-headed old kraut German. He's just a hard-headed old kraut." And I said, "I'm a bull-headed Scotchman." I said, "We'll get along." So Charlie liked that, and so that set the path. And after I'd finished fast, got it all wrapped up, a lot of problems. Oh my goodness sake, so many problems. Anyway, I pretty well wrapped it up, and Schwartz called me in one day and says, "Need you to go in and start another big project." He's highly classified, highly classified. It's a SAP program, Special Access Program, and so that's when I went out and took over the specific manufacturing project, and that's when I wound up getting involved with the tank and the Army. We could not say that we had any involvement with the Army. That was highly classified. And that's when we took the hangar out there. Interesting, that hangar was built when I was working for General Electric. And when they were using rebar, that 2.5 inch rebar, and 3/4 inch grout, and you could just sounded like a bunch of bees, bzzz, working that concrete in and making that hangar. Hangar is 90 feet tall, and we had to special route the wide flange beams to use just to support the structure while we were pouring the concrete. We had to special route them across all of the country to get them here. And it had always intrigued me because when I took that over and we wound up doing the job that we did, and we we wound up setting up an entire depleted uranium rolling mill setup here that had only been done down in the Rocky Flats. That's the only place it had been done. And we wound up building that section here to do it. And to get that built, it was interesting that we had to route the structure for that rolling mill all the way down through the Cape of South America because it was too big to come through the Panama Canal. So we had to route that all the way around. Come up here. Got it set up, and I can now talk about it. We used depleted uranium, and we were years fighting with Dr. Bloor, who was the Army's chief metallurgist, and he and I used to go at it something terrible because they were so afraid that the depleted uranium was going to oxidize to the point that it would not do the function. Well, I was asleep at the switch. I had depleted uranium right down here in this basement that I've had for 30 odd years. 1961. About 1961. When I'd been at the International Institute, we used depleted uranium to fabricate fuel modules like going to the MTR. And I'd forgotten I even had them down there. I could have won so many good arguments. Wound up one time going to the Army set up a big meeting with the Secretary of Army, really up there. And so they said, we need the Department of Energy. We were Department of Energy by then, to attend the meeting and explain to the Secretary of Army just what we're doing. And I said, fine, I'll get in touch with Troy Wade, who was the Department of Energy head back in Washington. And I called him and set up a meeting. I met him and I said, Troy, I says, I've got you set up for a meeting with the Secretary of Army to go over what we're doing in our connection with the Army making the armor for the M1A1 Abrams tank. And he said, well, why don't you go? And I said, whoa, that's way, way above my pay grade. Sure, it was way up there. You're talking right to the top here. And he says, oh, he says, you're the equivalent of a brigadier general anyway. He says, so you go. He says, that's it. So I wound up going and meeting with the Secretary of Army. And so we got all of that taken care of, and we carried on through, but they were always so worried that the depleted uranium would, for the wars in the Middle East, would wind up being the Agent Orange of Vietnam, but that's really, there's no comparison whatsoever. But
Grandpa, I think Grandma's home. What do you want this, Grandpa?
I worked. Oh, just set it down there, and I'll take it back in, honey. Like I say, I retired after being there running the SMC. Got it built, got it operating, and did a lot of work with General Dynamics and the Army back in Warren, Michigan. By the time I got through with that, I had almost 2 million miles built up on Delta Airlines. So when we retired, I had all of these miles to use up. So Grandma and I, we flew to Mexico several times, to the Virgin Islands, I don't know how many times, went to New Zealand, went to Hawaii several times, just using up those miles. And we had some very good trips. You've seen pictures of the big temple there in central Mexico of Chichen Itza. We climbed to the top of that baby, and the steps were about this wide and slick. They were just, you had to go up at an angle and turn and go up. That's the way you had to get up there. Zelda got up there and she says, "Now I don't know how I'm going to get down." She says, I don't dare try and get down." She says, "I need a rope." And I said, "Well, there's a big chain running down over here." She said, "Oh, okay." She says, "Don't you tell the kids." But she hung on to that chain and went all the way down. It was quite an experience to see what the game that they would play in this long courtyard. It was with a big rubber ball, and they would hit it with their hip, and the winning team would be sacrificed because they were going right on up into wherever they were supposed to go. But those cultures were brutal. They were really brutal.